Hello, everybody. Welcome to PR Future, the podcast from the USC Center for Public Relations. I'm Fred Cook, and today I'm going to talk with Eli Williams, who's the creative director at Day One Agency. This is our second study with Day One about Gen Z, and this one is titled Life Actually, a no bullshit study on the future that Gen Z really wants. And it's based on the game of life to find out how Gen Z is going through life differently than other generations. And there is no bullshit in it at all. We also are going to share some of the voices created by AI that represents the Gen Z participants in the focus groups we did in conjunction with this national survey. So let's get started. It was our second Gen Z project, Eli. Why was this one different than the last one?
Yeah, well, first of all, I'm happy to be here, happy to be back in the classroom. Always enjoy doing these projects. I think this one was interesting just first based off of the timing. We kicked off we did the actual survey ahead of the election in November, and I think some of the responses were illuminating, and I think kind of like illuminating early on. But I think what interests me about the survey study, especially someone who works in marketing, is kind of three things. The first being, I think like if the point of generational marketing and marketing around Gen Z in particular, which is kind of what a lot of brands strive for just based off of purchasing power and cultural influence, is to understand generations better, it seems like it might not actually be working because, and this has been going on for some time too. I was reading a part of this book called Truth, Lies, and Advertising by this guy, John Steele. And he speaks about marketers were kind of equally frothing around Gen X. And he said they chase after trends or people they don't necessarily understand and which don't necessarily even exist. And I think that's kind of relevant today where it's like, we have this idea of Gen Z in our head, but how much of that is really just marketing insights or marketing tropes versus reality? So I think this was kind of illuminating insofar as like, wow, there's this whole, which we'll get to, two other cohorts around Gen Z that we don't really focus on or speak to. But I'm curious from your standpoint too, what really stuck out?
Well, we did the survey last year about how Gen Z, we did an ethnographic survey study about how Gen Z interacts with information. And it was interesting because they're a generation that is always on. And I think it was now this time we're looking at their future and we use this game of life idea that like the board game and ask them questions about what decisions they were going to make, whether they're going to buy a house or rent an apartment, whether they're going to electric car, get a gas guzzler, and those kinds of questions, whether they're going to get married or be single. And it was interesting to me because I thought that there are segments of this Gen Z audience are a lot more like their parents than we ever imagined. And they have similar values that you don't really hear when people talk about Gen Z. They talk about being so different, but in many ways, the things they want are the same as what their parents had.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, Josh Rosenberg, CEO of Day One Agency, also who was a member of the board, USC Annenberg, just published an op-ed in a similar sentiment about Gen Z kind of being similar to boomers in many respects. I think you can tie that both politically, somewhat culturally. And, I think we'll get to it when we speak about some of the more conservative values. And that's not to say that all boomers are conservative necessarily, but I think what you usually read about is like, okay, the older generation, it's like the older you get, the more conservative you get is the kind of like trope that I've heard a lot. But I think what we're seeing now, and this is not necessarily one-to-one from the survey, is like actually there's a lot of conservative, and not just politically, but like culturally and, seeking out more stable families, trying to settle down earlier. That's happening earlier on. And I think that was surprising from the study too.
Do you think that you said earlier about a lot of marketing companies and branding companies do surveys of this generation and use those as a tool to get clients and do new business? But do you think that they're painting a picture, an unflattering picture, an inaccurate picture of Gen Z with these kinds of research projects?
I think you can take it to the extreme where it does become almost comical. And I think that is buoyed by data in which there is kind of foggy methodology. I think it's buoyed by this idea that brands in particular always need to be having conversations with younger consumers. And I think what's interesting is like if you're taking a bird's eye view, and now we understand that there's like three Gen Zs, if marketers are only taking a singular approach to try and target or communicate or Gen Z to buy certain things, it's not really going to land all the time because you're taking a one size fits all when there's actually multiple different sizes and people. And I think Gen Zers are starting to catch on. Like for me, on the older end of the Gen Z spectrum, I'm 28, and it varies from brand to brand and marketing agency to marketing agency, but like the kind of like stereotypical Gen Z speak does not appeal to me whatsoever. And I think should act as a bit of a wake up call too.
Well, if you combine that with what your previous study showed, is they're also getting information from totally different channels. So
Right.
not only is the message maybe a little off, but it's very difficult to reach Gen Z through the channels that marketers are used to using.
Right. Exactly.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the three groups that the research found, and they were sort of in equal numbers, equal size of the Gen Z generation. Tell us first about tell us about all three in whatever order you want. Do one at a time.
Cool. So I'll start with the one that I think you are probably reading a bit more about in legacy media. You were probably hearing more about it via podcasts. And this is what we call the neo-traditionalists. And I think this cohort really highlights the growing conservative faction, both politically and culturally, among Gen Z. And, I was speaking about how we kicked off this study in the summer, but actually right after Joe Biden dropped out of the race, we quickly swapped to Kamala Harris, and we saw that more of them wanted Trump to win, which I think was surprising because we have this view of Gen Z as very progressive, leaning to the left, focused on environmental sustainability, mental health, etc. And that has not been the case. And I think they're driven by this regressive nostalgia. They are fueled by a very powerful ecosystem of podcasters and influencers. And I think they're more prone to espousing traditional views, whether that's about family, the nuclear family especially. And I think that's part of a pushback against this kind of dominant liberal culture of the past decade, and also being very online. I think COVID had something to do with that. So if we get into the specifics, like I said, majority of this cohort voted for Trump. They're seeking more stability over kind of not polyamory, but playing the field. And I think you can see this out in culture. There are a lot more female focused magazines. One is called, or publications. One is called Evie, which is like, it talks about more traditional feminine values and starting a family earlier. They preferred gas over an EV, which I think is interesting, just given kind of Elon Musk's prominence in the Trump administration and how electric vehicles were at once like a culture war issue. Now that it's flipped, they prefer the suburbs over the city. And I think something we can extrapolate too is probably more willing to seek a more traditional career in the trades, opt for vocational school. I think this is something that we're seeing because college is more expensive, and I think they're seeing they can have a more stable job and career path moving forward. So that was my takeaway from the neo-traditionalist.
Let's stop there for a second. We, in addition to doing this study, we also conducted some focus groups at USC, and with these different groups, and we have some verbatims from the people that participated that will, I think, enlighten us on some of the topics you were just talking about. Let's hear a couple of those.
When I signed the lease on my townhome just outside the city, my friends raised their eyebrows. Why not wait? Why not move downtown? I felt a bit judged, but I knew what I wanted. A quiet street, a grocery store 5 minutes away, and a place that felt like the beginning of something long-term. I work in logistics, a steady, full-time, and not particularly glamorous job, but I like it. It's honest work, it makes sense to me, and it pays well enough so I can still save money. I don't need to chase side hustles or post my goals on Instagram to feel like I'm doing something right. Life is stable and calm. Not flashy, not fast, just real. Sometimes I think about my parents at my age already deep into family life. I admire that kind of clarity. I want that too, but on my own timeline. I imagine a future with someone who shares that mindset, maybe kids one day, definitely a backyard. Gas-fueled car in the driveway, Sunday barbecues, a dog running laps around the lawn. People joke that it sounds like the 1950s, but to me it sounds like peace. That's what I'm building toward. Not a feed-worthy life, but a grounded one.
That's a very interesting commentary, I think, on the neo-traditionalists. And the thing that struck me about it, Eli, was the timeline. That he mentioned that he wants the same thing as his parents, but on a different timeline. And I think that's an important distinction for marketers, to know that Gen Z is not in a hurry to do all the things that their parents did. And we have to keep that in mind as they're progressing. They're going to get married later, potentially. They're going to be buying a house later, but they still want to do those same things.
Yeah, and I think some of that is optional by choice, and I think some of that is just due to societal and economic realities. But I think, being privy to both of those is important, to your point, for marketers.
Tell us about the second group.
So the second group is what we're calling the fluid pragmatists. And this is kind of like the middle path, I guess, which sounds very spiritual. It's not. But these are kind of more moderate, thoughtful, slightly cautious, I guess. And again, like the name suggests, takes a more pragmatic approach to life, a bit slower, more deliberate, somewhat free-flowing to that extent, in terms of if we're talking about fluidity, like they may not have necessarily that plan sorted out right away, but whereas, we'll talk about the next cohort, which is more like experimental. These ones are probably less kind of wily and out there. And yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I think, as with a lot of things in culture, the edges are where you find the more interesting, juicy stuff. And this is kind of like the middle ground, I guess. And like you said, of this generation feels a lot like their parents. I think you could build that out into like this generation is like a lot of other generations before them. There are many different ways and paths along the way. So maybe we can hear more directly from some of these folks too.
Most mornings I wake up before my alarm. I sip black coffee while checking my savings goals. Not because I'm obsessed with money, but because I know where I'm going. My job in tech support, it isn't forever, but it's funding the version of life I want. No kids for now, maybe never, but definitely a dog. I'm not rushing to own a home or chasing some badge of adulthood for validation. I rent a small, clean apartment, and I'm eyeing an electric vehicle lease, one that makes real financial sense long term. If it's not practical, I don't want it. Growing up, my mom held down 2 jobs, then still made time to help with homework. That's heroic, at least to me. She didn't have the luxury of planning. She had to survive. And even though I inherited her drive, I'm lucky enough to direct it differently. I'm building something slow, something deliberate, something rooted in peace. Social media makes everything feel urgent, like you're behind if you haven't made it by 26. I've learned to tune that out, but some days, it's still a challenge. Now, I try to get advice from people who've been where I'm going, not from curated timelines. I'm not lazy, I'm intentional, and every decision I make is mine.
What was interesting to me in these focus groups was the consistent theme about money. I knew that was an issue, but I didn't know it would be so throughout the groups. And everybody seems to be very conscious of how much things cost. And maybe because many are in college, living on a budget or scholarships or loans. But I remember one person said that, which I thought was interesting for marketers, said that they only buy things they need, not things they want. So if they want something, they have to put it in the framework of they need it. And they use the example of buying makeup, and because you need makeup for job interviews, as opposed to just buying makeup to look nice. So that was the way they rationalized this want versus need. But money seemed to be a constant with this group.
Yeah. was reading about how about 60% of people who went to Coachella this year, or I don't know if it was people or Gen Zers or what the breakdown was, but regardless, had bought their tickets on a payment plan, on a buy now, pay later, which is not good. I think buy now, pay later makes it seem like you are more financially secure than you are. You could take that to the extreme. And this was very memed and discussed online about how you could put your burrito on a payment plan or something along those lines. But I think money is top of mind, I think, based off of the nature of social media, the kind of aspirational lifestyle that is so prominently pushed by influencers in particular, just how much commerce is centered on social media too. But yeah, I mean, growing up in a somewhat economically precarious position, especially now, I mean, who's to say with all of the tariffs and automation and all of that, but totally agree. It seemed that money or lack thereof was very prominent throughout. And I think, I'll have more to say when we get to the next cohort, because I think that is a big characteristic of them too.
Well, go ahead and talk about them.
Cool. So the next one that we have here is the Internet Age Explorer. And you can imagine that this is probably the closest one that we have to what marketers would consider Gen Z traditionally, no pun intended. So these are more of the experimental, exploratory group. They are what I call the kind of fuck around and find out cohort. I'm sorry if we can't curse. We can bleep that out after. No, on the podcast. And I think what's interesting about this one, if we're speaking about money, and I think this is true about Gen Z at large, how they react to it is different, and why we have this trifurcation is that they feel like the social contract has been broken. And I'm sure to some extent that has been true for many different generations before them, Gen X, millennials as well. But I think there's this economist that I really like reading. Her name is Kyla Scanlon. I would highly recommend students or whoever listens to this to check her out. She's also a Gen Zer. She wrote this piece called Gen Z and the End of Predictable Progress, where she also splits Gen Z into 3 different cohorts, a lot more different nuances than we have here. And it's very kind of economically nitty gritty. But she talks about this where it's like, why spend the time trying in school, trying to go up the corporate ladder, putting in the effort that it takes to start a family when it might not reap the same results. And what you have then is like, they don't believe in the traditional career path. There's a stronger desire of like the YOLO effect of, I'm just going to travel now or do whatever because I don't know when I'm going to be able to do it again. They're not necessarily rooted or even trying to be rooted to a profession, a relationship. It's very free flowing. And I think this is probably where you have more of a creator economy bent, more of a like playing everything like it's roulette. I could kind of strike it big, go viral, pay for the mortgage versus spending whatever, 30, 40, 50 years if we even have Social Security by the end of this administration or whatever with a 401k. It's like, I'm going to try and do everything now. Why wait? And to some extent, I'd sympathize with that a lot. So yeah, that was that cohort.
Let's hear from an explorer and see what they have to say about themselves.
I had a bit of an existential spiral the other night, but nothing too unusual. It's kind of crazy. One second I'm doom scrolling, freaking out about inflation. And the next, I'm planning a solo trip to Lisbon. Because, well, why not? That's kind of how life goes for me. I freelance in digital design. I share an apartment with 2 friends. I like it. It makes life cheaper, more flexible. But still, I'm always weighing whether to renew the lease or just pack up and move somewhere completely new. I don't feel pressured to decide, but it's confusing. Some days I feel ready to take off and see the world. Other days, it feels like this. Right here is exactly where I should be. I know it probably sounds a little wild. At my age, my parents were already married and pregnant. Meanwhile, I can't even commit to a gym membership. But that doesn't scare me. It excites me. I have time. And let's be honest, we live in a different time. I want to see the world before I ever think about settling down. There's this feeling I chase. It's not quite freedom, more like space. The space to be uncertain. I'm not afraid of instability, because I believe things will unfold the way they're meant to. I'm spiritual like that. Maybe naive, but it keeps me open, you know? I don't want a 5-year plan. I want to say yes to life as it comes. That means that some days I'll be overthinking about the economy, and other days I'll just want to dance on a rooftop and talk about astrology. My goals? They're not linear, but they're real. I want joy. I want discovery. I want to be exactly where I am and still keep moving forward, even if I don't know where forward leads.
Yes. I mean, I haven't been able to commit to a gym membership either, so I get that too.
But you hear the similar themes about their timeline, and about how much everything costs. Keeps coming back to that. But this group is a little more. You think this is a group that most people think about as Gen Z? Is the explorers, the digital explorers?
I think so. Yeah.
You know, I'm a baby boomer, and I grew up in the 60s and 70s. And when people characterize that time, it's always flower children and drugs and long hair and that kind of thing, the hippies. But there were not everybody was a hippie in the 60s and 70s. The same way now, there are different strokes for different folks in this generation, and that's what makes it complicated, I think, for people who are trying to reach them, because if the message isn't precisely in tune with them, they'll just ignore it.
Yeah, I agree. And exactly, you don't have the hippies without, I was not born in the 60s, and my parents, you don't have the hippies without a counterforce to rub up against. Also say, yes, every generation encompasses multiple different viewpoints, values, etc. I think what's interesting with Gen Z in particular is because they're so visible, and because it has become so easy to put out a headline, cultivate a data point around them, and then everyone kind of circles around that, and it becomes almost this groupthink, that it feels more prominent that people think of Gen Z as this one cohort. And from a marketing standpoint, you know, we've kind of shopped this around to some of our clients at the agency and spoken about it outside of just a strictly business standpoint. It's not that, okay, now you have to cater everything to all of these communities. You know, I think the important part for us is just like the awareness and knowing that there are different cohorts out there. And again, like, you really have to go wide, get a broader understanding to then take a more niche approach to certain subcultures, et cetera, which I think is one of the biggest takeaways. It's like, how much value is there really in this generational marketing, where if there's more like, and strictly focusing on demographics, where maybe we could be better suited and have more potent conversations, community activations or whatever, by focusing on interest groups, which I think have more crossover across different generations than we think. I mean, that's a larger umbrella takeaway that I've been thinking about from this report.
Let me ask you a question. You're a Gen Z and you work at a PR agency, and we just released a study called Mind the Gap, which talked about the generational differences of people working in PR. And Gen Z was a definite outlier from the Gen X and baby boomers and millennials. And it showed up in their views about AI, and about hybrid working, and also in the media. They seem very comfortable with AI, and also they seem to enjoy the hybrid working situation more than most generations. Not that they don't want to come into the office, they just don't want to come in 5 days a week. And in terms of media, they seem to be they're already where the puck is headed. They're much more comfortable with social media. They're less concerned about the demise of traditional media, and they are very big on influencers versus as being the route for marketing. And I wondered how you feel about in your role in the agency. Do you feel like you're leading the way sort of to where we're headed as a person in Gen Z, or do you feel like it's you're not there yet?
Well, I think this is again why it's so interesting is there's this reporter who's also Gen Zer. Her name is Rachel Jan Faza. We had some conversations about this. She had this chart that went semi-viral a couple months back that was like Gen Z 1.0 and Gen Z 2.0. So you're seeing a common theme here of like everyone's realizing it's not just one thing. How we speak about them is differently, and I fall into the 1.0 cohort, I think, which is older, the latter half of Gen Z, who graduated college post-COVID, who did not grow up with TikTok, had a flip phone before they had a smartphone. And I think that has influenced my views on the workplace and technology and media at large. So for example, and this is the first job I've ever had, I was hired January 6th, 2020. So I got 3.5 months before the pandemic, which dramatically altered, I think, the politics of, well, obviously many people. It dramatically altered the digital and cultural landscape. So my viewpoints on all of that, I think, has been formed. My clay had already kind of been solid, I feel like. I was not necessarily fully wet clay. Whereas I think if you're just coming into the workforce now, you are a bit more malleable to or driven by like the desire for hybrid work or AI. To answer those questions specifically, yeah, I mean, I think coming into the office and having in-person conversations is very important, particularly earlier in your career. I think that's helped me exponentially. I think, Day One is a very young agency. I think a third of the agency is Gen Z. And I do think that gives us a competitive advantage when you are talking about where does this generation or, where's culture headed from an influence standpoint? What are the media channels people are talking about or talking in? And then for AI, I mean, candidly, I'm the wrong person to ask. I have a complex relationship. I understand how powerful of a force it's going to be. I worry about leaving so much cognitive capacity to a machine. I think it's important I think process is important. And I think there's ways to make some grunt work more efficient. I use ChatGPT more as Google than anything else. But I think it's important to try and use your brain in some ways. And, if it doesn't work, then that's part of growth. I think that's important. But, we're early days with all of that too. So, yeah, I don't think I'm representative of a large cohort though.
Yeah, that's interesting. The pre-COVID and post-COVID idea probably has some real merit to it. But do you feel like when you look into the future of public relations and you see your generation leading the way, do you feel like people are ready for that and they have the knowledge and the vision for where this business is going to go?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, yes. Yeah, I do. It's a smart cohort. It's Josh hates this word scrappy, but I'll say scrappy. I think there's a bad rap to some extent for being lazy and not wanting to do some of the work. I think some of that's true, but I think are incredibly smart voices who are leading the media, who are prognosticators of media on multiple different fronts. I mean, Mr. Beast is like 26. I think he's indicative of like the influence of Gen Z. Now, is he influential to me necessarily? No, but he's worth $5 billion. And I think that speaks numbers of what success looks like for some people. But yes, I think so. We don't need to be bowling with bumpers forever.
I love that, bowling with bumpers. I remember those days. We asked one question, it was really interesting because everyone's getting information from different sources, each generation. And we ask the question, which generation is the best informed on current events, politics, and society? And every generation chose themselves and had very little to say about the other generations. Baby boomers thought they were the most well-informed and that Gen Z wasn't. And Gen Z thought they were the most informed and baby boomers weren't. How do you perceive that? Is that it seems like it's kind of funny, but it's also kind of a disconnect when the older people don't think that Gen Z is well informed because they're not reading the newspapers and watching the TV news the way they do.
I mean, yeah. I think that's an answer that I would expect. There was an article in Politico that recently came out that spoke about how Gen Z is the most gullible generation, tying that back to how the vast majority of their news diet is on TikTok, where, on social media now, there's no fact-checking mechanism at all. They've all abdicated responsibility. I think in some parts that makes sense. I think fact-checking, the merits of it are not necessarily there. And it became highly politicized. It feels a little preachy. I do worry, though, that we are coming up in a media environment where things are based more on personal truths than shared truths. And I think I worry about media literacy, especially coming from a young age, with the gutting of educational resources from higher education in high school, whether you're talking about book bans or government oversight of curriculum. I'm sure that's something as a university that's top of mind for you all. I worry about the fact that these platforms are increasingly filled with artificial intelligence, what people refer to as slop, which is kind of like low rent visual spam. And, now the onus and impetus for truth and accuracy is rested on the individual. And if you don't have a solid media diet, or if you don't have solid media literacy, that is worrying. And I think you need to learn that from a young-ish age. So I worry about Gen Z in particular, but the president of the United States thought that this Photoshop of knuckles, which is clearly typed, was a tattoo. And we don't have to get into that, but it's like, this cuts across multiple generations. And, there's the trope of like your uncle or aunt on Facebook that thinks the meme is real. So I want to be careful about sweeping generalizations, but I think the trend lines are worrying from a younger generation standpoint.
You seem very well informed. You've quoted a lot of different places you've read. Are you reading the newspaper or watching TV news, or where do you get your information?
Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to cut back on my media diet because sometimes it feels like eating soup from a strainer, where I'm like, what goes in instantly, it's like doesn't necessarily sit. But I read a lot of legacy outlets. I think there's a common misconception that legacy is dead. I think it's just the delivery mechanism is different. I read the New York Times, I read the Journal, I read a lot of Substacks. I really enjoy Axios. Kyla Scanlon, who I mentioned before, is this phenomenal economist, and she touches on different cultural themes, but I enjoy the economic lens. And I was terrible at econ in college. I think I got a C. I was not really a great student, but I like hearing about the kind of macro shifts. But yeah, I think it's important as a citizen of the world to be informed. You don't want too much because then you'll go crazy. And I think that's hard now. But, my parents, my dad would let me watch Jon Stewart with him when I was younger. They would always have the Times around and I'd flip through it. And so I think I've just been curious about all of that. But it's hard now. Like, you have your phone with you 24/7. It's hard to stay focused. Twitter is terrible. I'm still on it. But, again, you have to kind of separate yourself from it a little bit.
One last question, besides the media. When I was in my 20s, we thought baby boomers thought we thought we were going to change the world. And we were very big activists and protesting the Vietnam War and everything else. But ultimately, we didn't really change it. If we did, it wasn't for the better. Everybody bought houses and had kids and had mortgages. Do you feel like Gen Z is, the expectations of Gen Z are proportionally correct? Do you feel like there's a lot of expectations of this generation to fix the things that the older people haven't, or not?
I mean, I'm curious to think, did all of the problems feel so existential at the time?
Yes, they did.
Yeah. So it's hard for me to sit here and say they feel more existential. Somehow they do. I think that's just maybe due to the mass accumulation of capital resources in a small group of people's hands and the fact that they want to automate everything. And it feels like there's a lot of dehumanizing forces at play, both from a natural world standpoint and from a technological standpoint. And that to me feels very existential now about young people. I don't even think we have a choice. I mean, I was reading something that there's an 87-year-old who wants to take over the chair of the House Oversight Committee. And I'm sorry if this is delving too much into podcasts, but I mean, it's politics. But there's a gerontocracy problem in this country too, especially in leadership positions. And I think we need more younger voices in power now, whether we can get the organizing capacity to do it, the discipline to do it, that's a different question. But I don't think it's an unfair ask. I think it's needed. But I think there's a lot of cynicism. There's a lot of fatigue, just how you can re-energize that. And I think the next 6 years will be illuminating. But that's my main question.
It'll be interesting to see whether Gen Z can be an agent of change, if, like other generations, they will become more disillusioned over time. But we'll have to revisit this podcast in 6 or 8 years and see where we stand. But your research on it's been great working with you on this research on Gen Z. It's a fascinating topic, and I think that anybody that wants to know more about it should check out both of your reports, the one last year and the one this year. Where would they find them?
Cool. So you can go to, oh my goodness, you can go to d1a.com/perspective, or you can shoot me an email directly, Eli, E-L-I, at D as in dog, 1a.com, Eli, D1a.com. But yeah, check out our website. There's a bunch of other great voices and work there. It's very insightful. And appreciate you all taking the time. This was fun.
It's been a good conversation, Eli, and I really appreciate your insights and being part of the generation, and also sharing with us some of the research that we did together. And hopefully we'll do it again next year and have some different insights about Gen Z.
Yeah.
All right.
Well, thank you all.
Take care. Fight on.
Bye.
Thank you for tuning in. If you're interested in the full report, you can find the URL in the show notes. If you want to hear our other episodes, they're all on your favorite platforms under PR Future. My name is Fred Cook, and this is PR Future.